So, hello everybody, and a very warm welcome to this pre-recorded session and an introduction to becoming a community teacher for Kings. I'm Renee Paul. I'm a GP in North London and one of the teacher development leads.
And I'm Layla Abdullah. I'm also a GP in North London and one of the teacher development leads. So we hope by the end of this session today that you'll have a brief overview of the role of QMEC and our ethos, and we'll be talking a bit more about that in the live session. Reflected on what learning and teaching mean to you, and understand how to conduct a learning needs assessment and look at how to give feedback.
So I just want to talk to you a little bit about the MBBS curriculum 2020. So we have had our first graduates from this new curriculum, and the main drivers for the change in the curriculum were that, as GPs, we know this, we have patients who are living longer in the community, managed mostly in the community with multiple comorbidities. There was a drive to get students having experience in general practice and clinical experience early on. And more exposure to, holistic care. So seeing and spending time in general practice and in mental health. So our students will still, whatever route they've come, so that's worth you thinking about. We have students who might end up being on a slightly different program, so you might want to ask your student what program that they're on, but they will all do foundations of science. And then in year 2, there is a longitudinal placement in general practice where we have all 450 students or thereabouts in practices, usually in groups of 8 to 10, really learning about continuity of care, what you guys do in practice. There are smaller opportunities to get involved with research and scholarly projects and quality improvements in primary care. And then the next big placement that QMEC do, the King's Undergraduate Medical Education in the Community team, is in stage 3, which is year 5. And it's an apprenticeship where you have usually just one student, but some of our larger practices will have 2 in your surgeries for 8 weeks, really becoming part of the team, doing their own clinics. We've also more recently developed an IBSc in primary care. So these are the opportunities that you have to teach in practice, and there are also campus-based opportunities available, although numbers for those are fairly limited at the moment.
So we're going to be talking a bit about learning and teaching now. So thinking about preparing your learners and preparing yourself for the teaching session. So I'd like you to just pause for a moment and think about what learning means to you. So what's your definition of learning? And it's useful to gauge where you are in terms of your understanding of adult learning, as this will impact on your teaching. So here are a few definitions of learning, and it's useful to think about where your definition of or your understanding fits most closely with, and also how this has changed over time. So from it initially being thought of as an act of giving information and learning, retaining information, to learners being able to actually process information that's presented to them, where as per Piaget, the definition of learning is much more about how learners construct knowledge, and that's in an iterative way based on new experiences and really making sense of the world around us. You may have heard of Mezirow and the theory of transformative learning, which suggests that when learners are posed with a new situation and something that doesn't necessarily sit comfortably, a transformation occurs and there's a change in one's understanding of self and one's entire belief system about that and therefore behaviour. and that's known as cognitive constructivism. And that learning becomes a new creation. And for me, an example of this was a clinical humanities stage 2 student that I had last year, who was initially quite skeptical about the clinical humanities and couldn't see the relevance to his clinical learning. And it was actually at a poetry workshop where we were looking at walking in the shoes of others and seeing the world through the eyes of others, through and being patient experiences being expressed through poetry, where that was a pivotal moment for him, and that really changed his understanding and his understanding of the relevance for clinical humanities to him. So there was a real example of where we could see transformative learning taking place. And there are further theories, such as the last definition, which suggests that we learn in groups, in communities of practice. And again, another example where I've seen this really come to life is within our stage 2 GP tutors, where through a WhatsApp group and our various training events, the tutors, especially the more experienced tutors, have sort of organically supported the newer tutors and formed a community of practice, and where group learning has taken place.
So we are encouraging you to think about what sort of a teacher you would like to be, and also, I guess, what sort of a teacher we would like you to be. So Biggs has described these three levels. So level one is, what I imagine a lecturer might do who isn't being particularly interactive. The lecturer knows what he or she is going to say, is a sage on the stage. Is there to transmit knowledge? So very, very sort of teacher centered. With level two, the focus is slightly changed. So it's still teacher centered, but rather than focusing on what the student is or needs, it's focusing on what the teacher does. So you might vary your method and you might transmit some concepts, but it's not really taking into account our learners. And this is really where we want you guys to be, which is sort of level three, which is really thinking about your students, them as individuals, what their learning needs are, really tailoring your approach. And, we're going to do lots of practice soon for that. And thinking, what is it that this, student is doing, and how can I support them? So really, and, it's a bit more challenging when you've got a group of students, but really thinking about that individual in front of you and facilitating their learning. And if you've got kids, you have probably heard of the growth mindset. Lots of schools are talking about this, and we have a video to show you. I'll show you it later. But, I think some of our students will kind of fall into, and maybe even some of you guys will fall into these mindsets. So a fixed mindset is where you think, well, actually, I'm only this intelligent, obstacles feel kind of challenging, criticism might feel challenging, and then it sort of also breeds a degree of competitiveness. Maybe kind of seeing others succeed is quite challenging. Whereas on the other hand, if we adopted a kind of more flexible approach and a growth mindset to say, actually, you and we're all on a journey. I haven't got to where I need to yet. I'm constantly learning and developing every day. And as GPs, we know that things change all the time. And we really want our students to know that. So we're not expecting them to know everything at the moment. We want them to kind of, be able to tackle obstacles and challenges and gaps in their knowledge, just be honest about them and think, well, how will I fill those? How will I learn from this? And actually collaborate, thinking back to Layla's description of the communities of practice, especially when they're out in general practice in year two with 8 other students. We really want them working together, and in the future working together for their patients, their communities, or other groups that they belong to. So I think a learning needs assessment is the thing that I think we should all start with when we do any training session. But I think often is forgotten or skimmed over because we think, well, I know what I need to teach, or I know what I'm going to do in this session. And what a learning needs assessment is doing is thinking about the person in front of you, is really thinking, what do they already know? There is no point, telling somebody lots of information if they know it already. It's a waste of your time and theirs. What you want to do is build on their knowledge, and kind of see where the gap is, and how you can fill it, or ideally how they can fill it, what their next steps will be. So seeing where they're at, where they need to be, and how we kind of close that gap. And it's something that needs to be done at the beginning of every session. So I'm just going to get you to pause again and just think about how you will know what to teach. You might just want to get a little notepad, take a little pause, and we will discuss this when we are face to face. How do you know what to teach your students?
So I'm just going to talk through this model of competency, just to think about where your student is at in terms of the level of the learner. So after the sort of learning needs assessment, it's important to gauge, to make sure that you're targeting your teaching according to where the student is. And that might vary according to where they are in the program, but also it might be according to where they are on their learning journey for a particular skill. Um, so, ooh, sorry. So we'll take the skill of history taking, for example, and start with our novices. So these students are in the unconscious incompetence phase. So this might be our stage 1 students on their very first day of placement. So here they're unaware of the skill, and they're also unaware of their lack of proficiency. So they might not really understand what a history is at that point, and they're complete novices. They'll then go into the phase where of conscious incompetence. So here they're ready to learn, and this might be our stage 2 students who are starting to see patients and starting to learn to take histories. Sorry, my finger is being a bit trigger happy. So these students are aware of the skill, but they're not yet proficient in the skill. And then moving into the conscious competence. So these students are beginning to learn and they're practicing the skill, but they're still using it with effort. And then through to the expert phase. So the learning phase, the conscious competence phase might be your final year students, for example, and then the expert phase. So your qualified doctors, junior doctors, consultants, GPs taking focused histories or expert histories. And that's where it becomes automatic, and that's the unconscious but competence phase. And Johari's window is a way of it's another model that can be used to consider and help learners along that journey from novice to expert. So it was, this is always my favourite fact, it was developed by somebody called Joseph Luft and Harry Ingram, so that's the Joe Harry, and it's a model of feedback and self-awareness. So we've got different areas, so we've got the open area, which are things which are known to self and known to others. And then there are areas which are unknown to self, but known to others. Um, and areas which are hidden, so they're known to self but unknown to others. And then there's the unknown unknown. So there are various different methods that you can employ when teaching, which can help to open some of those areas. So for example, Socratic questioning, and we'll be talking a bit more about that in the live session, but that can open, and feedback itself can open the blind area. So I had a student a few years ago who had a nervous giggle when talking to patients, and although he was really conscientious. He was completely unaware that he was doing this. And just through feedback and making him aware of that, we were able to change that and open that blind area. So he could be aware of it and practice that aspect of his communication skills. And then through the relationship that you build with the student, so that relationship of trust, that leads to the student or the learner disclosing things about them, so opening into the hidden area. And then various different things like significant events, assessments can open that unknown area. So through these various methods, you can help your students uncover these areas and sort of improve their various different skills.
So it's always helpful to have a mnemonic, and when you're thinking about your teaching, you might want to consider ailments. And so it's always useful to think about the purpose and the intended aim of your session. So you might have an overall or overarching aim. So in this session today, we really want you to understand a bit about QMEC and get a bit of a basic understanding of who we are and our teaching methods. But within that, we've got more specific learning outcomes. You know, we're going to be talking about different forms of educational theory and, our rationale for teaching the way that we do. So you can break the overall arching aims down into more specific outcomes. Now, these might be set by you, or they might be set for each session by, the medical school. But sometimes you will have free reign. We've talked about the need to do a learning needs analysis, and I think it's a really important step, as I say, that sometimes people forget. You really need to know where your learner is at. Certainly as a teacher, you have a lot of control over kind of, the various methods you might try. And we are going to try lots of different teaching styles and techniques and methods in the face-to-face practice that you can employ, and just use a variety of methods. I always think it's important to end a session with, what have your students got out of it? What are they a bit kind of confused about? What might their next steps be? So the evaluation and next steps are hugely crucial. Now, tests and assessments might be something that, you don't necessarily do within a teaching session, but might be more formal assessment. But, you could do a quick kind of summary. And the way I prefer to do a summary to really bring together the end of a session. Some teachers I know will summarize the session themselves. I will ask the students to do that. If I've got a group of students, I will ask each of them to tell me what one of their take-home points was, or something they've learned. And actually hearing everybody else's learning points kind of provides a group summary. And then if I feel I need to add anything to it, I can. So I hope that just gives you a bit of a framework that you might be able to think about when you're structuring your own teaching. And thinking a little bit more about the strategies that you might use. This is from the Evidence-Based Teaching Network website. Lots of very user-friendly kind of tips. And these are their top 10 teaching strategies. I always like a good analogy because it just reminds me of, just I don't know, just sticks in my mind. My students or colleagues will always know that I have a note, a notebook, and I'm continuously sort of, if I'm in a teaching session, I normally say to my students, well, these days I'll say, get your phone out so you can take some notes, and that, or something you want to look up. I think it's really important, going back to our learning needs analysis, that we need to just reinforce things, and that might be via repetition or just going back over things that they had said were their goals, working together as teams to really kind of build upon their knowledge, and test out their hypothesis. And just thinking about preparing them in advance and giving them, maybe some of our students, a bit of information beforehand that you can then build on. Actually, we don't need to do all the work within the session. Some of the work, especially with online learning, can be done beforehand.
I'm going to talk a bit about feedback now, and that it and some of the important aspects of feedback. So for me, feedback always forms quite a big part of the actual teaching, and it's certainly quite really useful for students to get individualized feedback. But it's important that it's done in a way, and there are some rules which I'm going to talk through, that just considers what it's like to sort of receive feedback. So one of the things is that it should be agreed and invited by the learner. So the learner needs to be ready to receive that feedback. It should be relevant, and targeted. So based on the specific learning encounters that have just taken place, and usually if it's done in a timely manner, so as soon after the learning encounter as possible, it's much more likely to be effective and useful. It should always be non-judgmental. The actual feedback that you're giving should be clear and specific and based on observed behaviours rather than your sort of emotional reactions. And the in that way, when it's specific and it's about specific behaviours, you can then give tips, and suggestions for improvement, and how things can be changed, for the better. So what they could do differently next time. Overall, it's good for the feedback to be balanced, and that can sometimes be challenging. You should aim for sort of more positive feedback, but also give areas for improvement, um, and therefore the feedback will be constructive. Um, and obviously, it sort of goes without saying, but you're sort of giving suggestions, rather than saying you need to do this next time. But try to encourage the students to reflect on their own sort of performance and come to those uh, come to the feedback themselves, and possibly the things that they can do moving forwards, to improve the performance. So things like goals, on what they can work on for next time. So here are just a few phrases that you might want to have up your sleeve, when you're giving feedback. So I noticed that. So that's based on a behaviour. How were you feeling when? So again, getting them to reflect on what they were doing and why they did that. What were your thoughts? And how might you do that differently? So there are various different feedback models, and some of these you might have used. Uh, Personally, I tend to use the Pendleton's rules, particularly as that gets the whole group involved in giving the feedback. And again, this usually can form quite a big chunk of the teaching session, and get some really good discussion going. You might want to have a look at some of these different feedback models, and we'll be discussing and thinking about them a bit more in the live session.
So many of your teaching sessions with QMEC will be in small groups. Certainly, those on campus will be, and in the earlier years, the only time really that you would have one-to-one teaching is in year 5 in stage 3. So we thought it'd be helpful to think about what is a normal process for a group, especially if, as in stage two, you have a group for a whole year. And so actually, there are stages that a group will go through. So to begin with, they don't know each other often. They have, not met before. And so actually they're getting to get an idea of who they are, what their shared thoughts and beliefs are, what their ground rules are. It's really, really important in small groups to establish what ground rules are. Don't assume that everyone has the same ideas of what is expected, and actually your students might have expectations of you as well as vice versa. So I think that's a really important bit to encouraging safety within the group. There's often a bit of conflict or what's called storming when, especially if they have a task that they need to do together. Um, and so sometimes people might take over or not know who sorts out what and how this group sort themselves out. And so they might need a bit of guidance and facilitation from you. Hopefully, what happens next is usually that the group actually focuses on the activity and starts working together. They sort of, might say, well, listen, for this particular project, we'll be the nominated leaders, and then, we can choose who wants to do what, and, and have oversight. So they're all working towards a common goal. And if it's been a good group, usually at the end, when you're all coming together and closing, actually there's a period of sort of mourning and sadness. And I have a lovely story I was once told by one of our stage two tutors who, for her very, very first stage two group, um, about 6 months after they'd left, they all called her up, and just said, "Could we come and have a coffee? Because we still really miss all being together and getting together." So, a good group will certainly, engender some of that emotion at the end. There's also challenges for teachers, especially when you are maybe new to teaching, or feeling a little bit nervous, or in a sort of group and not quite sure exactly, what to do. So there's some common sort of pitfalls. So rather than encouraging dialogue, we might feel like we have to know all the answers. So doing less of the facilitating and more of the lecturing, um, and therefore talking too much. I know we're very much,
Mhm.
the DSR is the didactic Socratic ratio. So Layla and I, we promise you are very Socratic, and we'll ask you lots of questions when we see you face to face. But actually, there's times when, being didactic and just giving you information like we're doing here is probably the most efficient use of time. So that's what we're doing here, but that isn't what we will do in the small group. Um, we mentioned the growth mindset, and just thinking about, is that something you have with all your students? We can sometimes come filled with assumptions and biases, and sometimes, we might have a bias about or an assumption about a particular student, and we really need to support all our students to flourish. Um, sometimes we're sort of flying blind. So, maybe we haven't prepared quite as much, and, or we don't know the students or the material quite as well. And there's it's interesting. I always think it's important, if you found out about your students, and you've got a student who maybe is a psychologist or did a degree in pharmacology before and knows more about something than you, then actually I think you can use that to your benefit and to the group's benefit. So, but for some people that might feel slightly challenging or threatening. So, in groups, we just need to think what we're like as kind of individuals and teachers, and how we kind of, maybe are aware of the things that we might fall into, some of the traps, and what we do about it. And so basically we wanted to just let you know that if you haven't got groups in your problems in your group, then something's wrong. This is sort of a normal process within a group, and it's one of the challenges, and actually is often quite enjoyable as a teacher, finding ways around it. What we don't want you to do is get stuck on your own with something. So if you have tried a few strategies, then and you're getting a bit stuck, then please come and see us. I remember one of our tutors speaking to me and saying, actually, there is one student who just takes over all the time. And as a group, we sort of talked about different strategies, what you might get that student to do, what their role might be, maybe as scribe, really going back to ground rules and, and just reminding people that it's really important to hear from everyone, to listen, to try and, be respectful of other people, give everyone else their chance, to do lots of breaking them up into small groups. And she sort of went away with all these suggestions that the group of teachers had come up with and really sort of said to me, I just don't think it's going to work. And then got back to me the next week and said, oh my God, I tried this. I tried all of this and it worked. Actually, I can manage it with just as a teacher, just using, slightly different tools and setting it up. Actually, you can kind of often manage things. If it's something that maybe is a personal problem for the student or two individuals, if it or a clash in personalities, then that might be a bit more difficult. And certainly please do ask us sooner rather than later. And sorry, go on, Layla. I'd forgotten I wasn't doing that one.
So one of the things about small groups and now that we have the luxury of more face-to-face teaching again, is thinking about how you set up the room. Is that just that sort of physical change and setup can really have quite a big impact on the group and the group dynamics. So here are various different layouts how you might have chairs and a table, with T being yourself, the teacher, and the rest being the students. So we'd encourage the sort of lilac setup or the pink setup. Because this will really allow and encourage more of a facilitation than that sort of didactic teaching, where where there's discussion going on within the group, and similarly, so using that sort of setup, this just shows the sort of lines of communication between the student and the facilitator. So this sort of setup will encourage more facilitation and more discussion. But as you can see, what you want is to have dialogue being opened up between the students, not just sort of one way between you and the individual students. And that will support that sort of more facilitatory role, rather than the didactic teaching. And it just generally adds to much more richness when you've got everybody involved in the discussion. And I found this particularly when with our clinical humanities workshops, which are quite small, and each pair was doing a different project, and if we sort of stuck to the first structure, there was almost silence within the rest of the group, and it was just a sort of one-way dialogue about that individual or that pair's project. However, once we started getting the others to sort of feedback, and this was actually done in the online environment, it was much more the sort of dialogue that was going on was much more representative of the B lines of communication, which just makes it much more interesting and interactive for everyone. So at the end of the session, it's always useful to get feedback for yourself to sort of understand and reflect on how the teaching has gone. And one way to do this is using the what model. So thinking about asking the students, so what did we do in the session? So just to kind of summarise, and then the so what. So what did they learn? What are they going to take home? What are the main sort of summary points? And now what? So what will you do differently as a result? And that provides a way of feeding back how much the students have gained from the session, which might then impact on what you might do differently, and how you might reflect on how the teaching session went as well. So just a useful tool to sort of summarise and close.
So thank you for bearing with us. We're almost at the end now, and we, are really delighted to kind of have you join us today. We thought it would be best to do the theory in this way, so we have lots of time for practical stuff. But just to sort of tie it up, as well as welcoming you to QMEC, just wanted to let you know there are lots of opportunities for you to continue to learn and develop and practice as a teacher. We have a whole host of workshops that we run, not just us as the TD team, but with colleagues. We have conferences at the moment. It's 2 a year that have been half days online. Um, Pending COVID, we'll see what happens. We would love to have you all on site back at Guys again. So, um, we have student-led workshops and ed speakers, so very short, snappy talks from other medical educators and students. We do support practices and do practice visits for our new practices, or if there is an issue, we're not doing as many routinely now, but um, you know, we love to see as many of you as we can. And the benefit to the pandemic has been, we're used to doing things online. So, we have been walked around practices showing on a laptop, so we can do it all online. If you would like a peer review of your session, so either a QMEC member of staff or one of your peers, another stage 2 teacher if you teach year 2, just watching your teaching session and giving you some feedback, then there is a small amount of remuneration for that for the peer reviewer. And we've got forms and a template that you can use. So do contact us if that's something you would like to do. We've said this already, and most of you will have a wonderful time teaching us, but you are teaching our students, and teaching us, and we learn from each other. Um, but you are GPs as well, and healthcare professionals, and you are likely to pick up if there is a concern with a student, and you might be the first person that notices. Sometimes they get lost on big hospital wards and placements where they're only there on an ad hoc basis. So trust your kind of antennae and your gut, and if you're concerned, don't just ignore that. Just let us know. Feel free to ask the student permission or speak to them first. But just trust your gut and just let us know, because we can certainly pick that up and signpost the student. There are lots of student support services that the medical school provides. Lovely. And we'll share with you the references, and just right at the bottom, we also have a QMEC Teachers YouTube channel, which we've developed over the pandemic. Hopefully we'll have more and more resources added on over the year, but there's a section on remote learning and remote teaching and on teaching theory. So we hope you'll find some useful, very short videos there. Thank you very much for
Thank
listening.
you.